Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating journey. We're going to explore a deeply complex, globally recognized historical event, but we're doing it from a very specific angle. We're looking at the Falklands War, or as it's known in South America, the Malvinas War, strictly through the Argentine perspective, exactly as it's presented in our source material. And just to be absolutely clear right from the jump, we are remaining completely impartial here. We're not taking sides, we're not endorsing any viewpoints, we're just here to unpack the historical narrative, the geopolitical context, and the cultural mindset of Argentina leading up to and following the conflict. Honestly, it's an incredible story full of colonialism, political desperation, and national identity.
Okay, let's dive right in. If you really want to understand the Argentine perspective, you absolutely have to start right here with this exact phrase: Las Malvinas son Argentinas. In Argentina, you guys, this isn't just some political talking point. It is a fundamental cultural axiom. Basically, every single child in the country learns this phrase from a very early age. And what's wild is that it transcends the typical political spectrum entirely. Whether a citizen is left-wing, right-wing, socialist, conservative, libertarian, it doesn't matter. This belief unites all of them. It is just a deeply, deeply ingrained part of their national identity, which is super crucial to keep in mind as we look at how the events of 1982 actually unfolded.
But before we get into the heavy politics, let's just look at the geography for a second, because it presents this stark, almost humorous contrast. The islands themselves are in extreme isolation. We're talking a population of roughly 3,500 people, mostly of British descent, sharing the land with about 500,000 sheep, and get this, over 1 million penguins. Now, from Europe, these islands are incredibly far away, right? Which historically made communication and supply lines a nightmare. But from Argentina, they are just over 500 kilometers from the coast of Patagonia. Geographically speaking, they are practically right next door. And that physical proximity is a massive factor in why Argentina has always felt such a strong, undeniable connection to them. So here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We're going to cover 1. The roots of the claim, 2. Peronism and nationalist dreams, 3. The junta's dirty war, 4. The fatal invasion gamble, 5. The 74-day conflict, and finally 6. Defeat, democracy, and legacy. All right, starting off with Section 1, the roots of the claim. To really understand the events of 1982, we literally have to rewind hundreds of years to this chaotic game of colonial ping-pong. Argentina traces its claim all the way back to the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. Though, funny enough, the French actually built the first settlement there in 1764 before just handing it over to Spain to keep up good neighborly relations. Fast forward to 1820, a newly independent Argentina officially raises its flag over the territory. But then, in 1833, a British warship shows up and forcefully expels the Argentine garrison. And for Argentina, this 1833 expulsion, that is the original sin. That single event forms the entire basis of their modern sovereignty dispute. Which brings us to Section 2, Peronism and Nationalist Dreams. So jump forward over a century later, to 1946. The rise of Juan Perón completely transformed this historical grievance into a massive political tool. He introduced Peronism, which is this uniquely Argentine ideology that blends robust social policies with extreme nationalism and fierce anti-imperialism. And in the context of the Cold War, this brilliantly illustrates how Perón operated. He essentially framed the British presence on the Malvinas as this lingering, totally unacceptable European colonialism. He made reclaiming these islands the ultimate, shining symbol of Argentine sovereignty. Naturally, this led to decades of diplomatic push and pull. In 1953, Perón actually offered to just buy the islands outright, but Winston Churchill flatly rejected it. By 1965, the UN officially recognized the sovereignty dispute. And surprisingly, throughout the 1960s, British governments were genuinely considering a compromise, like maybe selling them and leasing them back for 99 years, kind of like what they did with Hong Kong. However, when Margaret Thatcher's conservative government took power in 1979, the door on those compromises was slammed firmly shut. Moving on to Section 3, the junta's dirty war. Following Perón's era, the country faced extreme economic and political instability, and this eventually allowed a military junta to seize total power in 1976. Led by General Jorge Rafael Videla, they launched what became known as the Dirty War against supposed state enemies. We are talking about widespread repression, secret prisons, brutal torture, and those chilling death flights where political prisoners were literally dropped alive into the ocean. It was horrific. Meanwhile, the economy is stagnating with runaway inflation,
So the junta notoriously used the 1978 World Cup, which Argentina hosted and won, as a massive political distraction to mask the atrocities happening just blocks away from the stadiums.
Section 4. The Fatal Invasion Gamble. So, by late 1981, that World Cup glow had totally faded. General Leopoldo Galtieri takes over a regime that is facing an absolute economic crisis and massive domestic protests, like the famous Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. The government is on the brink of total collapse. So the crucial point here is that the invasion was born out of pure, desperate political survival. To unite this furious, fractured nation, the junta decided the only way forward was to finally pull the trigger and deliver on that childhood promise, reclaiming the Malvinas.
I know, looking back, it sounds like complete madness, but the junta's logic relied on some truly massive miscalculations. First off, they actually believed Britain was just too far away and too distracted by domestic strikes to fight back. Second, they expected their anti-communist allies in the US to stay neutral or even support them. Third, they just assumed the Soviet Union would veto any UN resolutions purely out of spite for Thatcher. And fourth, they were terrified of losing all regional respect if they didn't act decisively, especially after a near war with Chile in 1978.
They genuinely, truly believed they were launching a quick, bloodless, special operation. They thought the British would basically just shrug and hand over these severely underinvested islands without a fight. But wow, the reality was a monumental shock. Margaret Thatcher did not capitulate. Instead, she immediately dispatched a massive, heavily armed naval task force straight across the Atlantic to take those islands back. Which brings us into Section 5, the 74-day conflict. The war officially kicked off with the Argentine invasion, codenamed Operation Rosario, on April 2, 1982. And initially, it was a success. The small British garrison was overwhelmed without a single British casualty. When the Argentine flag was raised for the first time in 149 years, massive, sweeping celebrations erupted in Buenos Aires. Galtieri's crazy gamble actually worked for a second. Left-wing and right-wing citizens were pouring into the streets together. But, and this is key, they weren't celebrating the dictatorial junta. They were strictly united behind the national claim to the islands.
But man, that unity did not last long. Once the British fleet actually arrived, the brutal reality of war set in. The entire conflict lasted just 74 days. That's it. But it was intensely violent and deeply devastating for both sides.
Now, what's really interesting here are some of the details from the ground war. Because Argentina feared an attack from Chile on their mainland, they actually kept their elite ground troops at home. This meant the troops defending the islands were largely young, poorly equipped conscripts, often teenagers, who were so undersupplied they literally had to hunt local sheep just to survive. On the flip side, the Argentine Air Force proved highly skilled. Flying at insanely dangerous, low altitudes, they inflicted heavy damage on the British fleet, most famously sinking the HMS Sheffield. And get this, the war also saw some bizarre blunders, like the BBC accidentally broadcasting British attack plans for goose green over public radio, somehow completely forgetting that the Argentine troops were listening in. The conflict also saw immense tragedy and, frankly, lasting controversy. 323. That number represents the amount of Argentine sailors who died in a single event. Early on, the British submarine HMS Conqueror torpedoed and sank the Argentine cruiser ARA General Belgrano. That one single act accounted for nearly half of all Argentine military casualties in the entire war. From the Argentine perspective, this was a deeply controversial, unnecessary escalation, mostly because the ship was actually sailing outside the internationally declared exclusion zone when the order to sink it came down directly from London. And finally, Section 6, Defeat, Democracy, and Legacy. With their navy confined to port after the Belgrano sinking, and their young conscripts facing elite British infantry in the freezing cold, the end was pretty much inevitable. On June 14, 1982, the Argentine forces officially surrendered at Port Stanley. And look at the rapid domino effect this defeat triggered. Just 3 days later, a totally disgraced General Galtieri was forced to resign as furious crowds gathered in Buenos Aires demanding the junta be removed. Within 6 months, the whole military apparatus collapsed. And by 1983, Argentina held free, democratic elections, finally ending the dark era of the Dirty War. So the military war ended in 82, sure, but the cultural claim to the Malvinas, that remains fiercely alive today. It is permanently embedded in the national psyche. We saw this famously just 4 years later during the 1986 World Cup. Diego Maradona scored his legendary Hand of God and the goal of the century to defeat England. And that victory was widely celebrated across Argentina as the sort of symbolic revenge for the war. Even today, in recent World Cup victories, you'll see banners claiming the Malvinas proudly displayed by players and fans alike. The military campaign failed, but the core belief, it absolutely never wavered. Which leaves us with this final, absolutely massive, provocative question from our source material to wrap up today's explainer. The war was an undeniable tragedy that cost hundreds of young lives. But considering that this humiliating defeat directly caused the immediate collapse of a brutal, murderous dictatorship, did losing the Malvinas War ultimately save Argentina? Did that crushing military loss inadvertently gift the nation its freedom and its democracy? It is a super heavy, fascinating irony to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Argentine perspective. Take care and keep questioning history.